Welcome, everyone. I'm looking at the back to make sure I am licensed to speak, and I believe that I am. Thank you so much for coming to this event on living with Russian ambition, perspectives from Central Europe and the Baltics. And first, I should excuse my voice. I believe it will get through the next few minutes, but better for everyone if I don't. My name is Keith Brown from the Malakian Center for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies here at Arizona State University. And I want to start this event by thanking our co-sponsors who made this event possible. They are the primary hosts for our four speakers tonight. The Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, Barrett the Honors College at ASU, and the New School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. But a few words about the Malakian Center, where we were fortunate enough to pull this event together, and its mission. The Malakian Center exists under its current name thanks to the generosity and commitment of Gregory and Emma Melikian, whose support has meant so much to Arizona State over the years. The center was originally founded in 1984 by a group of faculty concerned, like others in the United States at that time, that a lack of understanding across geographical and ideological borders heightened the risk of catastrophic conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's now almost 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dismantling of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. Some optimists, most notably Francis Fukuyama, saw this as demonstrating that a Western model of rule of law and private enterprise outperformed authoritarianism and communism and foresaw a future of political and economic freedom spreading peacefully across the entire globe. Others, perhaps most famously Samuel Huntington, were skeptical, anticipating that differences in religion and culture in particular would persist and provide the basis for a new clash of civilizations. So who was right? Well, what we know is that since the fall of the wall in 1989, Russia and the United States have both continued to invest in military capacity and in the business of preserving or growing their alliances and spheres of influence. NATO, constituted originally as a defensive alliance to protect against Soviet aggression, intervened in Kosovo in 1999 against Serbia, a venture that was strongly criticized by Russia. And since then, NATO has further expanded its membership in Eastern Europe, including the four countries we have guests from tonight, Hungary and the Czech Republic in 1999, and Estonia and Latvia in 2004. Across that same period, Western organizations expressed support for organizations calling for human rights and democracy movements, like the three so-called colored revolutions in Georgia 2003, Ukraine 2004-5, and Kyrgyzstan 2005. Meanwhile, Russia has intervened with military force in Chechnya in 1999, Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014, and Syria in 2015. And Russia has also waged economic pressure, cyber warfare, and information operations further afield. These influence operations have included a large-scale cyber attack on Estonia in 2007, disinformation campaigns waged through Hungarian media, and in the view of the United States Congress, and the intelligence community, most recently reflected in today's briefings, interference in the 2016 US presidential election. So this is the reality that prompts our panel today. Whatever the awareness, intentions, or motivations of United States actors, the pattern of Russian foreign policy during the Cold War, and more specifically its trajectory since President Vladimir Putin first came to prominence in the year 2000, is pretty clear. Russia's leaders have been willing to take calculated risks when they see their country's security under threat, including bending or flouting international norms. That sense of Russian security is threatened by the country's decreasing economic clout, as its reliance on income from exports of oil, coal, and gas makes it vulnerable to energy innovation, and also makes it vulnerable to concerted international action on climate change. And that security is also threatened by the enlargement of NATO, most recently Montenegro's decision to join the alliance. Russia's standard operating practice across this period has been to locate or suborn allies or proxies within rival or hostile countries to weaken the will or the unanimity of those countries to act. Whether it be Russian ethnic minorities in Latvia or Ukraine, in-country oligarchs and business elites in Hungary or Montenegro, or clickbait entrepreneurs on Facebook, wherever they might be based, the Russian government knows how to mobilize the efforts of these disparate actors in Russian interests. And this poses a challenge for policymakers and citizens who desire a future of less rather than more Russian influence in their countries. One response is to take strong, collective, non-military measures or sanctions to deter future repetition. And that was the response that the US and the European Union took to the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and that was the response most recently extended by the US congressional vote last July. If you'll recall, an overwhelming vote to expand sanctions in response to evidence of Russian interference in the US election. And you can see that response also in a different domain taken by the International Olympic Committee in response to systematic cheating by Russia in the last two Olympic Games, allowing participation this year by Olympic athletes from Russia rather than Russia. So those responses presume strength and robust international cooperation, and those responses assert principle and commitment to international law. US President Trump has chosen a different line, ostensibly pragmatic, placing a premium on continued or strengthened relations with Russia as more beneficial to the United States than an adversarial response. Russian efforts to rewrite the rules of international relations have only recently hit home in the United States, and there's still, I suggest, a strong sense of disbelief or denial that such a thing could be happening. Countries closer to Russia have far longer and more immediate experience, and their citizens and leaders are more familiar with weighing the trade-offs of how to respond to Russian ambition. And so tonight we have four accomplished speakers with an array of policy, scholarly, and journalistic experience of that issue. I've asked them each in 10 minutes or so to share with us some reflections on the particular challenges their country has faced in preserving its integrity and security in the face of Russian ambition, and the kinds of strategies or tactics that have worked to do so. We'll then, after their comments, we'll then open the floor for questions. And if you do have questions at that point, I'd ask that you wait for the mic to reach you, and please identify yourself by name. Just an alert that we are live streaming this event, and we hope to archive it as well. And so having your name, if you choose to ask a question, will be very helpful to us. We'll end this formal part of the evening at around 6:30, or before 6:30 if we decide to move on. And I want to invite you all to a reception just outside and to the right in the Mojave room, room 236. So our speakers' names and short biographies are available in the flyer that you saw on your way in. You can also see them on the Malakian Center's website. But let me introduce all four very briefly, and then we'll get to the good stuff. So first, Dr. Vara Vicker-Friberger is currently scholar in residence at Barrett, the Honors College at ASU. Following an academic career, she was elected president of her native Latvia in 1999, serving 2 four-year terms during which Latvia gained membership in the European Union and NATO. She was an official candidate for the post of UN Secretary General in 2006. Dr. Michael Kraus is Frederick C. Dirks Professor of Political Science at Middlebury College. A native of Prague, His research has focused on the transition of Eastern Europe after communism, including edited and individual work on the economic dimensions of that transition, as well as transitional justice. Holger Runemeyer is a 2017-18 Hubert Humphrey Fellow at the Cronkite School and head of news for Easter Päevaleht, a major daily newspaper in Estonia, and Delfi.ee, a major internet portal in the Baltics. He's been nominated for Journalist of the Year award from his newspaper and has continued to pursue investigative journalism, including his story on Russian spy agencies' mobilization of smuggling networks, which was published on BuzzFeed last September. And finally, Szabolcs Panyi, also a 2017-2018 Hubert Humphrey Fellow, is a leading investigative journalist at Hungary's most read independent news site, index.hu, and vsquare.org, supported by the National Endowment for Democracy. He won the Gobolis Soma Prize, awarded for the best investigative articles in his country for 2 consecutive years, in 2015 and 2016. His reporting focuses on anti-corruption and national security-related issues, mostly on Russian influence and disinformation. So thank you again, and please join me in welcoming our 4 guests. Do you prefer to speak from here or there? Which do you prefer?
Oh, I think I prefer to... Are we sitting later on the chairs?
We're sitting later.
I put down my bag.
Okay.
I'll stand here.
All right, thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of how we view our neighbors is one that I think makes us of interest to a great many people. I could only wish that sometimes they would be interested in us for our own sake. But when you have a big neighbor next to you, obviously the attention is focused on them. And, well, yes, we do have a sort of front seat on the behavior of our neighbor, obviously, simply by geographical proximity. The general concern that people will ask about is how do we view the actions either of Russia as a country or more concretely of its president, since he has been now in power for a substantial length of time. And one gets the impression that Russia is like, in Churchill's famous phrase, enigma wrapped within a mystery, etc., and that you sort of have to read tea leaves or gaze into crystal balls or use divining rods to try and outguess what they might come up with next. And they do indeed come up with surprises regularly, certainly with some regularity. And I must confess my own naivete is that when France happened to be chairing the European Union in the first 6 months of 2007, also my last 6 months as president, President Sarkozy decided to publish a volume on European security and asked me to write a chapter in it, again, Latvia's point of view about the general situation. And I have a phrase in there which will make me blush for the rest of my days, because I said, well, thankfully, one thing we can be sure of, that from now on, those days are gone when foreign tanks would roll across a sovereign country's territory, occupy it, and annex it in many cases. And no sooner had the book appeared in July 2008 8, because it took some while for it to be out, we had the invasion of Georgia, 8th of August, I remember, and the tanks did come rolling, and came rolling to within 49 kilometers of Tbilisi, the capital. So that I was, if ever, wrong, then that is one time in my life when I really put my foot in it. Because I naively was convinced that we had international law and order since the collapse of the Soviet Union, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, that the new Russia, the Russian Federation that was born from the ruins of the Soviet Union, much as Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, the Caucasian countries and so on were born from the collapse of that union, that after all Russia had every chance to become a democratic country. Why not? Communism had failed visibly. Surely they would seize the day and the occasion, much as these other countries did, and certainly the Baltic states foremost among them. Well, that wasn't quite the scenario that they had in mind. So what did they have in mind? I think there's no need to guess or to read tea leaves or to gaze into crystal balls. They are perfectly clear and coherent in their attitude as to where they stand and how they feel. And this really hasn't changed very much at all since Soviet times. To put it in 3 words, I would say that the feeling about themselves that I see as a former psychologist, see cultivated among the Russian population is a feeling of mission in the world, of exceptionalism, of being special. Now, of course, you as Americans, I don't have to teach you about exceptionalism. I think you know very well what I mean. So that, of course, the Russians are not the only ones to suffer from that disease. But this exceptionalism is linked to a sense of martyrdom. And the martyrdom that they have the answers to the world's problems. The Russian civilization is superior in many ways to the increasingly degenerate and decrepit mores of the disintegrating Western world. They have the vigor and the vim to continue in the new age. They have a sense of mission, if only others would have the good sense to follow what they say. And I had a colleague, Sergei Karaganin, who's well known in European circles. We sat together on a committee for the OSCE, chaired by Ambassador Ischinger, who, as many of you will know, is many years on end, has been the founder and the organizer of the Munich Security Conferences. We were a group from different European countries, and our Russian colleague made it very clear what Russia's position was in terms of after the invasion of Crimea and its annexation. And it was that everybody had been humiliating poor Russia ever since the Soviet Union collapsed. And I tried to tell him, I said, Sergei, it's not just Russia that was part of the Soviet Union. There were numerous other countries and even more numerous peoples in the Soviet Union. To say that that was Russia is intellectual laziness, and of course the Western world is terribly guilty of that as well. So the Russians came to believe that the Soviet Union was Russia, which just factually is not the case. And that the collapse of the Soviet Union, as President Putin has made amply clear, including to personal conversations with me, he saw it as an absolute catastrophe, a disaster, a hardship for his people. He told me, he said, look, the Russians in Latvia, they went to bed in a country in which they were at home, the Soviet Union. And then they woke up and they were in a foreign country, Latvia. And they were actually asked to become naturalized if they wanted to remain there and become citizens. It's extremely offensive to them. They were really offended at such a thought. Well, I said our citizens, somehow, at least the ethnic Latvians, but I know a great many Russians as well, thought that the ability to, and that passports, if you have to go to travel across the borders, you needed passports, he said. This is so inconvenient. I said, it's true, we did have an awful lot of people who crossed that border in cattle cars and wound up in Siberia without any passports or papers at all. And frankly, I think they'd be very happy to have their passports back and to travel anywhere in the world, whether east or west, according to their choice. I mean, it does make a difference. So clearly, you see, right from the start. And my friend Karaganov also reminded us that the position of Russia is not a mystery. You look up on the internet his speech at the, let me see, it would have been the 2008 Munich Conference of Security. And he lays out his plan for European security, which essentially would like to see, it doesn't say so necessarily in so many words, but the picture is of dismantling NATO, just like the Warsaw Pact countries. Actually, the pact simply disappeared. They actually joined NATO, as it so happens. And that Russia should have a say in everything that goes on in Europe. When Russia talks about reorganizing the architecture of European security and generally international relations, what they mean is that they would sort of order everybody around, just like they did with the satellite countries during the Cold War period. Now that is, of course, sort of a basic difference of view that makes it extremely difficult to hope to bridge such a gap, such an intellectual gap, by conversation. And this is where I'm sorry to be a bit pessimistic about the efforts of successive American administrations to be more or less friendly with Russia and to ensure that the world will be at peace thanks to their efforts in that regard. My impression, and that's only my own personal view, is that you can stand on your heads. It's not going to make a difference. The Russians have a view of their history, of their mission, of their destiny, of where they want to go, and they're going to go there. And anybody else, even a big country like America, is unlikely to sway them unless under duress. Indeed, under extreme duress, of course, they will deviate from their course, as does anybody under extreme duress. But if freely left to their own devices, they would not. And this is why I do think that alliances such as NATO have a crucial role to play. The participation of the United States as a major partner in NATO is crucial for European stability and peace. I can only say we always breathe a sigh of relief in my part of the world when the new American administration comes in, starts pushing all kinds of restart buttons and so on. The buttons don't work and we're not surprised. And ultimately things go on as they have before. Of course you have to talk to each other. It's obvious. You need diplomatic relations, you need efforts of mutual understanding, but one should not be naive and one should certainly not be complacent and, as it were, fall asleep on one's watch, but be aware that strength is something that Russia understands. It is something that they aim for themselves. They want to be respected, they want to be seen as strong, and they have respect for others who are big, fat, and strong. So America has to do its best to remain a major force and one that is interested in what happens in the world. There used to be a lot of comics in Europe who picked up the inauguration speech phrase about America first. There was one comic in the Netherlands who perfectly imitates the voice of President Trump. And he says, "Mr. President, could we maybe beg you to think of this tiny little country with its tulips and its wooden clogs and so on? Would you allow us to be number two? Understanding that you, of course, want to remain number one." I think that all of us would sort of really, I mean, it was a joke that went all across Europe, but we actually do feel like that. America first, of course, everybody puts their own life, their own goals, and their own country first. It's as it should be. But not only, please. So what we would like to see is an America that, even as it looks after itself as well as it can, and it should do that it remains interested in what happens elsewhere in the world, and that does remain interested in the balance of power across continents, including the one on the Eurasian continent. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure, indeed an honor, to be here with a panel of distinguished participants. It's my misfortune to follow a president of Latvia, whose remarks, of course, make me still abound in some reflections about what she has just said. I'd like to thank the organizers for having me join this panel. Now, I will start by giving you a glimpse of the world from Prague, a brief one, and then try to look further afield so we have some time for perhaps broader questions. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Czech Republic's president, Miloš Zeman, former leader of the Social Democratic Party, former head of the parliament, was re-elected narrowly to another 5-year term, just by 150,000 votes out of over 5.5 million votes cast. Zeman is a highly polarizing figure who's been a presence, a fixture in the Czech Republic. He is rather outspoken and on record to have said many controversial things. And he defeated in this campaign, in a bitter campaign, in a divisive campaign, Jiří Drahoš, who was a former president of the Czech Academy of Sciences. And the contest was seen by many in the Czech Republic. Well, I should add that the president in the Czech Republic is a head of state, so there is a parliamentary system, so he doesn't hold the kind of executive power that president does in this country. But nonetheless, he has significant powers. He appoints, co-appoints ambassadors along with the foreign minister or the cabinet. He also nominates Supreme Court justices. He also names the members of the central bank. He represents the country abroad. And very importantly, he decides who, after an election, will get the first chance to compose a cabinet. And Czech Republic happens to have had elections in October, and ever since has been trying to put together a cabinet. So the significance of the presidential election was enhanced by all of that. In any event, it is the cabinet that sets the foreign policy, but Mr. Zeman, as president, conducts his own foreign policy, often ignoring Czech commitments or the policies of the government. Unlike the Czech government, which has generally been in the mainstream of European Union policies, Zeman is the most pro-Russian head of state in the European Union. He was invited shortly before the election, not by accident, to visit with President Putin on an official state visit. Spent 5 days there, and during that visit he expressed his opposition to EU sanctions against Russia. He also was on the record as saying that events in Ukraine are a civil war. He believes that Russia is doing a good thing, he praised, in Syria. And he also called President Assad a legitimately elected leader, which is basically what was expected of him in Moscow. So he did very well. Of course, this is much to the chagrin of at least half of the population of the country, or maybe more, who resent his various stances on these issues. But there was a slight mishap during his visit in Moscow, which was in late November. The army newspaper came out with an article celebrating, on the occasion of the head of the Czech Republic, celebrating the Soviet intervention in 1968 as providing form of liberation from a counter-revolution. It was right back to 1968, as if nothing had happened, as if even the Soviet government under Gorbachev had not apologized to the people of Czechoslovakia for having committed an act of aggression. Well, this was a little too much, even for Mr. Zeman. After all, he had an election ahead of him. So there was some kind of an apology in the next issue of the newspaper that this was a misstatement. In any event, it's also telling, I think, that when Mr. Zeman, President Zeman, met with Vladimir Putin, there were only two people who accompanied him. One was his head of staff. His name is Mr. Rastislav Minář. And what's interesting about Mr. Minář, who has been with Zeman for 5 years, is that he has never been able to actually obtain a security clearance for the post that he holds in the castle. And President Zeman has repeatedly said that if he can't get this security clearance, he's going to have to go. But it's been 5 years. Anyway. And then the other fellow who was with him is Mr. Nejedly. He's not even, I think, a government employee. What's interesting about him is that he was the head of the Lukoil company in the Czech Republic. And as such, he, by all indication, provided some ready standby cash for Zeman's re-election in case it was needed. Another interesting feature of contemporary Czech Republic is that there is a think tank, which is a good thing, that monitors some of these nefarious aspects of Russia's intervention in Czech affairs, which are typically subterranean and often subtle. And they have identified about 40 servers, internet servers, that apparently are basically sources of disinformation, agents of Russian influence, if you like, and that actually often manipulate information as it comes. And so when we ask a simple question such as, well, what was the impact of these servers over the last couple of years in terms of making a difference? Is it possible that the 150,000 votes that separated the two candidates could have been impacted by the role of these servers? That is to say, had Mr. Drahoš won 80,000 votes, he would have been the president. So we will never know, but as we ourselves have experienced recently in this country, social media, Facebook, you name it, have admitted to have had a part in providing a forum for perspectives that were actually originating out of some troll farm in Russia. Okay, so, but why should Russia really care about the Czech Republic, you might say? Or even, why should we care about the Czech Republic for that matter? Well, as is the case of Hungary or Estonia or other Baltic states, Prague is a member of NATO and of the European Union. And if you can exert influence over these countries, which the big, fat, and whatever adjective you use, Russia can, then of course you can actually, you have an asymmetry of power that is considerable, and you have leverage over both. Through Czech Republic or Hungary, you can actually have leverage over NATO or the European Union. So I think that is indeed the logic behind some of these Russian operations that we have to take very seriously. And of course, the big prize is NATO and the European Union. We all know that there's something called Article 5, which commits NATO, it's a principle of collective security, and to create uncertainty about that commitment, actually, as our current president has done during his campaign, is clearly to court a grave uncertainty in terms of our security commitments. And similarly, the same goes for NATO. It's remarkable to me, anyway, and I spend most of my time over here, although I travel frequently to Prague, that for all the rising relative prosperity of the Czech Republic, which enjoys perhaps the second highest standard of living after Slovenia out of all of these countries, however you measure it, that the support for the European Union has gone like this over the last 15 years. It has declined. So we have people like Miloš Zeman who have contributed to that because he's a critic of the European Union, and so was his predecessor, Václav Klaus. Further, in terms of Russian interest in the Czech Republic, the Czech government is planning on modernizing 2 nuclear power plants to award these big energy contracts has generated interest in both the United States as well as in Russia. And of course, we're not looking to companies that do this kind of work. There's not many actually around the world that do build nuclear power plants, a giant investment. And there are not many countries that even want to build them. They're not alike because, of course, the Russian companies are state-controlled, and they basically serve energy companies in particular as instrument of Russian state. So many fear that awarding this contract to Russia would actually increase Czech dependence on both Russian energy, and it would further bind the Czech Republic into the Russian orbit. But what I'd like to say about that presidential election, there is another purpose I have, and that is that what the election demonstrated was that the Czech society today, much like many of the neighboring societies, Hungary, I believe, or even our own country here, are bitterly divided. There are 2 camps in the Czech society. One camp, and I'm going to generalize, tend to be comprised of people with higher education, people living in Prague. Prague is like a state within the state. It is way above the EU average in terms of income, average income, and so on. It's people who have education, advanced education. It's people who tend to exhibit trust towards the outside world. outside institutions like the European Union, who actually see the European Union, who see globalization as a source of promise, and who belong among the beneficiaries of the post-1989 transformation. On the other side, or in the other camp that was prominently in evidence in this election and in previous elections, and it is the camp of which President Zeman is the leader, they look at the world with fear. Fear of the outside world, fear of foreigners. They find they have a harsh view of the establishment, both at home and in Brussels, where the European Union resides. They want strong borders. They emphasize protection against foreigners. Sounds familiar? Well, it is, because there are similar tendencies at work in other countries, in France, in Austria, in Hungary, you name it, and of course in the United States. But there are two points of contrast between, say, West Europe, United States on the one hand, and East and Central Europe. One point of contrast is that the Central and East European countries, the Baltic countries too, of course, they're part of that, have obtained their independence relatively recently. And so the idea of independence, which they gained, held its appeal, but before they could really enjoy it, it became, in the view of the critics, submerged in the sea of the European Union. Of course, there's another way of looking at it, which is that being a member of the European Union carries huge benefits. So it's not so simple. But the other point that I think is also important to bring out is that in contrast to the West Europeans, of course, many Poles, Czechs or Slovaks or Romanians feel disappointed by the post-1989 transformations. Their aspirations have not been fulfilled, while they look around and they see that many an oligarch or a crook got away with it. And so that really is part of the story here. What we have now, I'm afraid, I mean, we've been focusing on Russia, but we also have on our hands a crisis of liberal democracies that goes beyond Central and East Europe. What we have seen in recent years is a rising distrust of political elites everywhere. We have seen how huge income disparities, for example, in the United States, where the successive administrations have not lived up to the expectations of the middle class to improve the standard of living, how these have delegitimized even our own system of government in the eyes of many. And there is much more going on than that. There is the rise of populism, people who have simple solutions to complex problems, complex issues. There are indications at every level. If you look at the metrics that are used, for example, by the Freedom House, an organization that for decades has tried to do its best to capture the trends, that following the 1990s and even into the first decade of our century, we've had an expansion of freedom and democratic rule into many countries. That in more recent years, starting going back about a decade, we have seen a decline. There are signs of decline. And decline of trust in democratic institutions, signs of backsliding on the one hand, but also powerful authoritarian regimes that are pursuing their own interests and that actually see a vested interest in weakening democracies. Here, I think we have to ask ourselves about our own role. And I'm afraid that historically, if we look back, the fate of liberal democracies, that is, democracies rooted in the rule of law, has always been tied to the rise and fall of great democratic powers. And so we bear a major responsibility in this equation, which I'm afraid we're not living up to. I'm going to pause on that. No, thank you.
Hey. First of all, I'm very thankful to Keith for inviting me here, and it is really an honor to be part of this really distinguished list of people discussing on such an important topic. So if you don't mind, I will try to get the story back to the Baltic side for a change. I'm supposed to have a couple of slides as well. I don't know how it works or if it works. Yep. Ooh. Oops. No notes. Okay, that's perfect. Thank you. So next week Saturday, Estonia will celebrate its 100th year of independence. Estonia managed to declare itself independent on the 24th of February 1918 in the aftermath of the First World War, when the Germans had retreated from a country and the Russians were not yet back in. Before declaring independence, Estonia had been under the Tsarist Russian rule for over 200 years. The Tsarist Russia conquered Estonia in 1710, when they conquered it from the Swedes during the Great Northern War. Our independence, we got to make our own decisions from 1918 up until 1940, when the Soviet Union occupied us and we were forced to join the Soviet Union. During the Second World War, Estonia, as several other countries of course, exchanged hands a couple of times. When Nazi Germany came in, and then again the Soviets came in. So when the Second World War ended, what followed for us was 50 more years of Soviet occupation. That's up until 1991, when we managed to restore our independence. So out of the 100 years that Estonia has been independent, for roughly half of it, we have been occupied. We have not been able to make our own decisions how to run our government, how to rule the country. That is the context about Russia's ambitions in our region, that over the last 300 years, 250 of those we have been under someone else's rule. That is the context. And what makes us think that this ambition of Russia has changed, Russia, Soviet Union. As President Freiberg spoke before me, and she has personal experience with Vladimir Putin. I can only reflect what I have been reading from the media and what I have been working on my own. In 2005, President Putin publicly said in a speech that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. Some of his colleagues, some of the other people in the regime have openly talked about how the independence of the Baltic countries is only a temporary error of history, and it will be corrected sooner or later. Having said that, and of course we see what both Keith and President Freiberger have referred to. We've seen what happened in Crimea, we've seen what happened in Georgia, we've seen the failed coup attempt in Montenegro a couple of years ago. And of course we saw cyber attacks against Estonia in 2007, which were the first cyber attacks directed at the nation state. They lasted for somewhere around three weeks. And why did it happen? They originated from Russia. Why did it happen? Because Estonia's government had decided to remove a World War II era statue from central Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. The statue had been put there by the Soviet power, and for the Soviets it it meant the liberation of Tallinn and Estonia from Nazi Germany. They said that they liberated Tallinn and Estonia. For all the Estonians living there, it reminded every day of us of 50 years of really tough occupation. Because we wanted to remove that statue to a military cemetery, street riots broke out, which were agitated by Russia, and of course the cyber attacks followed. So after Crimea, Estonia was flooded by foreign journalists from New York Times, from The Guardian, from Washington Post, you name it, from everywhere. I was a fixer for several of them myself. What we all wanted to do is that we wanted to go to Narva, which is the town that you see on the picture there. On the photo on the left-hand side, you see the castle of Narva in northeastern part of Estonia, and on the right-hand side of the river, it's Ivangorod, that's already Russia. 90%, even a bit more, of people living in Narva are Russians. So the question that everybody coming in, every foreign journalist coming into Estonia was to ask that, is Narva next? Is Estonia next? I hope so, and so far we can say that it will not be next. Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service issues yearly assessments of security, annual threat assessments, and the latest one was published only last week on Thursday. And in that, the Foreign Intelligence Service says that the only existential threat to the sovereignty of Estonia emanates from Russia. But having said that, they see no threat of direct Russian military attack on NATO in 2018. NATO, of course, Estonia and the other Baltic countries are part of NATO. But at the same time, it is worth remembering that Russia most probably would use every chance it has. The only thing why it is preparing, but it doesn't have a chance now, because Estonia, as the other Baltic countries, belongs to NATO, and that is something of a red flag until now to Russia. But it doesn't stop them from preparing. And when the chance arises, I am sure that Russia will use it quickly and without hesitation. So what are the three actual ways how Russia is preparing, or how it is willing to make, how it is preparing to grab the chance if it should arise? First of all, military exercises. Every 2 years, Russia conducts a huge military exercise called Zapad, which means West in Russian language, in its Western military district. The last such exercise was conducted in August and September last year. Officially, it lasted for 6 weeks. Officially, it lasted for 6 days. Actually, it lasted for 6 weeks. Officially, Russia said that little more than 10,000 troops participated in it. Actually, more than 100,000 troops participated in it. The reason why they didn't want to say out officially or publicly about the true numbers of troops is also probably related to the fact that when the number of troops participating in an exercise exceeds a certain limit, they should have to allow foreign observers to come and see the exercises. The exercises took part, if you imagine Russia's border with Finland starting from the north, the exercises took part from behind the Finnish border. They took part behind the Estonian border, behind the Latvian border, in Belarus, and in Kaliningrad, of course. In that exercise, we practiced a full-scale war with NATO, and especially a direct attack on the Baltic countries and Poland. And the exercise, the part of exercise also escalated into a full-time nuclear war with NATO. So that is the kind of reality how Russia practices to grab a chance. And it is not only military exercises that they are dealing with. It is also constant reforming of their units, constant upgrading of weaponry, and creating new units, actually. So in 2007, the first group of new generation fighters were deployed in Kaliningrad, the SU fighters, which you can see on the photo there. This year, Russian Navy's Baltic fleet will get new missile corvettes, which will be armed with caliber cruise missiles with a range of 2,500 kilometers. And quite significantly this year, I believe it already happened, but please don't quote me on that. I'm not an expert. I don't have that intelligence myself, but I read I believe I read somewhere in the news that already this year the Kaliningrad missile brigade was armed with a new generation of tactical ballistic missile system, Iskander, with a range of 500 kilometers. A similar missile system has been deployed for several years now behind Estonia's southeastern border with Russia in the Pskov region. And if you take together these two sets of missile systems, they cover most of the Baltic states. And more importantly, the one placed into Kaliningrad covers the whole border area between Lithuania and Poland, which means that in case of real war, Russia would be able to cut the Baltic states off, and it would be extremely difficult for our NATO allies to come and help us. And last of all, the third way how Russia is preparing, which is my favorite topic, is espionage. What you see here on the photos, these are actually very fresh photos taken last Saturday on Piusa River Bridge. It's a border point between Estonia and Russia. What you see here is a classic exchange of spies. The guy in the skinny jeans, his name is Artem Silchenko. He was convicted last winter in Estonia for espionage. He was recruited by Russian military intelligence, the GRU, already back in 2008 and caught in Estonia only in the beginning of 2017. He acted under the cover of owning and running a baby stroller business. He drew direct inspiration when GRU recruited him. He drew direct inspiration from his great-grandfather, who during the Second World War had worked in the Soviet army in NKVD and later the Smersh units, which are notoriously known for their violence in detecting spies, in detecting deserters from the units, and so on. He was the fourth generation of military people in his family. But it is only not the guy. Of course, we got one guy back as well. The guy with a wider smile facing this way is an Estonian businessman named Raivo Susi, who was convicted in Russia for 12 years in prison for espionage. Allegedly, he is an Estonian businessman. The Estonian security services have decided not to comment on his possible relation with them. But in Russia, he was convicted for espionage. But the case of Silchenko is not a solitary case. Over the last 9 years, he was the 10th one to be convicted for espionage or treason. The guy on the top left corner, his name is Herman Simm. He is the first man in Estonia to be convicted of treason. I believe it happened in 2007 or 8. He was the head of National Security Advisor's Office for many, many years, meaning that most of the communication between Estonia and its NATO allies, highly classified communication, went through his desk. And all of the time he worked for Russians. The people on the top row, they all worked in either Estonian security services, and the woman is actually a wife of one of the men who worked in Estonian security service. They acted as a couple. And the 5 men on the bottom row, they are on the completely opposite row of espionage, on the completely opposite end of it. They were really small-scale smugglers, well, large-scale smugglers, but small-scale spies. They operated on the southeastern border between Estonia and Russia. Their everyday business was to smuggle cheap tobacco, cheap gas, cheap alcohol, and in many cases they helped smuggle Vietnamese people from Russia to Estonia to go on to European Union. But while doing so, FSB from Russia also recruited them to spy on Estonia's military installations, on the movement of troops in southeastern Estonia, on Estonia's border guard tactics, border guard personnel, and so on. So if you take into account military exercises, rearmament of units, direct military espionage that's going on in that region, we pretty much get to see what's the ambition of Russia, why we are worried about it. But as said, but luckily we don't see a direct military attack coming this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here and to speak with you after the distinguished guests. When I usually introduce myself and I say that I'm an investigative journalist from Hungary, I mostly cover Russian influence, I usually get the question, what's so special about Russian influence? Why is this fixation with Russia? Why is Russia so special? Why is Russia different than French influence or German influence or US influence? And when I think about that question, I usually give the answer that the main difference is transparency and the lack of it, corruption. When I talk about Russian influence in Hungary, I'm mostly going to talk about some very sad topics which are connected to how the Hungarian political elite is allegedly bribed by Russian companies, by different Russian actors, and the most serious cases I had to deal with were cases when certain Hungarian bureaucrats or politicians were not only bribed or bought by Russian politicians or Russian companies, but in fact they were agents of the Russian Secret Service. So I'm a journalist, I write stories, so I'm going to tell you some stories tonight if that's fine with you. Unfortunately, Hungary has been on the front page of major US newspapers like the New York Times or the Washington Post quite frequently in recent years. Not because of our great culture or our great culinary experiences. I think you're all familiar with goulash, very good Hungarian food. No, those articles are mostly about why do you have a prime minister named Viktor Orbán meeting Russian President Vladimir Putin twice a year? What's wrong with you? I mean, you Hungarians, you used to be like the so-called best students out of the former Soviet bloc. After Hungary regained its independence in 1989, Hungary has joined the EU, Hungary has joined NATO, Hungary so-called westernized itself. So why is this setback happening right now? And one of the sad answers is its transparency and its corruption, and it's linked to Russia. There's a story I just heard a couple of weeks ago from the former Hungarian ambassador to Washington, D.C. He recalled me a conversation with former Hungarian Prime Minister. He was called Péter Medgyessy. He was a very great figure in the early 2000s. The only thing that makes him a little bit more interesting to us is that it turned out that he had a code name, D2009, because he used to be a secret agent of the Hungarian Communist Secret Police, and the Hungarian public only got to know that after he was elected as prime minister. I mean, I hope nothing happens in the US that's similar to that, and I hope nothing like that will came to light. I hope your president doesn't have anything in his past as this. But the Hungarian Prime Minister was indeed a communist secret agent. And when I talk about the Hungarian Communist Secret Service, basically I'm talking about a local affiliate of the KGB. So we've been having some problems with transparency. We don't know who our politicians are really, because Hungary is the only country, I think, in the region which did not ban former communist Secret Service members from holding office, for running for office, or for just keeping their job in the Secret Service. And when I talk about communist Secret Service, and when I talk about old stuff, what happened before 1989, I'm talking about this because we still don't know where the true alignment, where the true honor of these people are. Are they more? Do they think on themselves as aligning with Russia, serving Russian interest, or are they just Hungarian patriots? And there are different cases. And the thing is that we still don't know who is who. And till this day, there are certain cases when we just read in the newspaper that it turns out that a Hungarian politician is actually of Russian ancestry. So what happened a couple of years ago is that a guy who has a very typical Hungarian name is called Béla Kovács. He used to be a member of, he still is a member of the European Parliament. He's working in Brussels. So it turned out that the guy is actually a Russian spy. So one of my colleagues started to investigate the past of this guy, and it turned out that his father, his real father, he was raised by a stepfather, but his real father was a Russian officer. And no one knew about it. It was kept secret. Even the guy didn't know that his father was a Russian military officer. But when he got onto a trip to Moscow, and when we think he was confronted with his past, he flipped, and from that day on, he started working for the SVR, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency. And we didn't know anything about that. This was just a regular guy, nothing charismatic about him. He was doing some business in Russia. He had nothing to do with politics. And then in the mid-2000s, he returned to Hungary. He joined a political party which is called Jobbik, which used to be the major Hungarian far-right party. And he managed to turn an anti-Russian, anti-communist far-right party to be the most pro-Russian and pro-Kremlin party in the whole region. How did he do that? With money. He gave a car to one of the leaders of the party. He donated money to the party. And no one asked, where is this money from? He said, I got the money from Russia because I was a businessman. Okay. What we did is we looked into the business registries in Russia to see what kind of companies did this guy own. Nothing. So we still don't know where's the money from. I mean, of course, now we know where's the money from, but throughout two elections in 2010 and in 2014, when this party got 10 and then 15% of the votes, the voters did not know that one of the leaders of a party is actually a Russian secret agent. Now we're just talking about a fringe party. As I told you, this is just a party with support of 15% of the population. But on the other hand, we have a governing party, and we have this guy I mentioned, Viktor Orbán, who has a support of 50% of the Hungarian population, which is something very remarkable since he's been leading the country since 2010. And last year, as I already mentioned, Vladimir Putin visited Hungary twice a year. That Vladimir Putin, who's in a war in Ukraine, which is a neighboring country to Hungary. That Vladimir Putin, who has been conducting secret service and also military operations against neighboring countries and against EU countries and against the US. And still he's welcomed twice a year in Hungary. How does he do it? We don't know. Getting back to this old prime minister who used to rule Hungary 15 years ago, and the story I forgot to tell you. So the story is about this guy, Péter Medgyessy, having a visit to St. Petersburg to meet Vladimir Putin. And they were having a talk for like half an hour, and after they finished, Putin came up with a genius idea. Can I take you to the airport in my car? And the prime minister, coming from a country of 10 million people, said, yeah, sure, of course, yeah. So they went to the airport in the car, and guess, do you know what they were talking about? Do you know what topics came up? Do you know what kind of deals they struck while they were driving to the airport? Of course, no. I don't know either. No one knows. And even the newspaper coverage about that meeting was about, we don't know why the prime minister went to Russia. We don't know what they were talking about. So when I'm talking about Russian influence and when I'm talking about why it's special, this is why it's special, because there's no transparency. We don't know what's going on behind the curtains. And I don't want to pick on this guy. I mean, he's retired, he's old, he had his time. But the problem is that all elected Hungarian prime ministers had their own one-on-one private conversations with Vladimir Putin, and we don't know what kind of deals they struck. We don't know what they were talking about, and we don't know if they were bribed. We don't know if they were blackmailed. We know nothing. So when I'm asked about why are you focusing on this topic of Russian influence in Hungary, it's because of the mystery, because of we don't know what's happening behind the curtains. Let me tell you just a final story, which I did last year. It was about a public procurement procedure in Hungary. Has any of you ever been to Hungary, to Budapest? Wow. Ooh, okay. So if you've been to Budapest, you might have been having a ride on the Budapest metro, those old Soviet blue metro cars. They might be familiar to some of you. So the municipality of Budapest decided to replace those with some new ones because they were smoking a little bit, they were catching fire, the brakes were not really working. You know, it's good old Soviet quality, but after 40 years, even those might not be working that well. So the Hungarian government and the municipality of Budapest decided to get some new cars. And there was a public procurement procedure, there was a tender. Companies from all over Europe and all over the world were allowed to compete. There was a company from Estonia, Skinestrel. There was a company from France called Alstom. There was Skoda Transport from the Czech Republic. And of course, there was a Russian company named Metrovagonmash from Moscow. And it turned out that when the public procurement procedure started, people were chatting about stuff like, you shouldn't be competing, it's going to be the Russians who win it. The Russians always win it. And guess what? It happened. So I went after this story, and what I discovered was quite troubling. First of all, this company that was competing to replace some old metro cars, it's called Metrovagonmás. Now, in Russia, the problem is that everything is connected to the government, and almost everything is connected to the military. You might be familiar with the tragedy of the Malaysian Airlines in 2014, the MH17 flight that was shot down over Ukraine by pro-Russian militia. Actually, it was shot down by an anti-aircraft missile system that's called Buk. And guess what? Buk, this military equipment used to be manufactured by the same company, Metrovagonmás, the same company that's producing metro cars, that's producing peaceful equipment. It also used to produce military equipment. And when something's connected to the military in Russia, of course, it's connected to the secret services. So I went after that, and it turned out that the Hungarian representative of the country, who had a Hungarian name, was in fact born in the Soviet Union. Interesting. It also turned out that the Hungarian counterintelligence know this guy very well. Of course, they didn't tell me what exactly they know about it. I just got the tip that you should be looking after this guy because he's not quite the guy he pretends to be. So it turned out that there is a Russian company competing to win a business in Budapest that has military backing, that has state backing, and that has secret service backing. And they won. How did they do that? They did that with using all their powers. There was a guy who was in charge of the public transport in Hungary, a young guy who's loyal to the government, but he knew that we're not going to replace old Soviet cars with new Russian cars because, you know, the technology, maybe that's not the most modern one, maybe it's not the cheapest. So the Russians were quite angry about this guy, and what they did is they started spreading rumors about him. They started spreading fake news. They started spreading disinformation, saying that this guy picked a fight with our ambassador. How rude is that? So what our government did, they were frightened that there's going to be like a diplomatic scandal because of this, because our guy, this guy in charge of running the public transportation system in Budapest, he picked a fight with the Russian ambassador. How rude is that? Of course, none of this ever happened, but it was enough for the Russians to spread this disinformation among Hungarian government circles. So they instantly decided that we should get rid of this guy and we should give this business to the Russians. And that's what happened. And when I talk about the lack of transparency, I also talk about the corruption that's basically exported from Russia. It means that countries that are in the orbit of Moscow are not just threatened by military exercises or military equipment or troops. I know this sounds weird, but I think that's a better case when you know who's the enemy and when you know who's playing which team. But when your own political elite is corrupted, you just don't know anymore if that guy who's supposed to represent you actually represents you or he represents some other interest, and those other interests might be interests of the Russian government. So when I say that the transparency is the key to understand what Russian influence is really about, then I'm also saying that we need investigative journalism, and we also need the counterintelligence services, because although these are very different professions, but these different professions are the ones who are dealing with uncovering what's not transparent and uncovering what Russia wants to keep in secret. Thank you very much.
So thank you to all four speakers. Could you just join me with another round of applause for our speakers? So we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. I'm going to hand this mic to these folks, and David here has a mic for anyone in the audience. Anyone want to pose a question, response to anything you've heard? Do you want to start over there?
Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for... Thank you so much for joining us. It's a very refreshing to hear specifics from people like yourselves rather than having it filtered through the media. So that's very helpful. And if you all would be interested in addressing one of your neighbors, which of course we read through the media, with Poland and its new heightened and tightened control, and also what's the latest situation on the military. The last I knew, NATO was and was not and was considering arming the frontier. Can you address what's happening there and the reasons behind it? Thank you.
So just to check, did everyone hear the question in the audience? Yeah.
I think about the security of the frontier. NATO took already a decision at the Wales summit, that's something like 4 years ago. And then at the Warsaw summit, it was concretized. By now, in fact, by the end of 2017, NATO has stationed 1,000 troops in each of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and I think more than 1,000 in Poland. One country one NATO member sort of takes charge of a rotating force of different NATO countries who make up one half of it, and the lead country, if you like, has 500-600 soldiers. Like Latvia has Canada, who is the lead country, but we have also troops from Slovenia, I think Slovakia, Italy, and they do rotate so that all NATO countries are represented. Britain has a special task, I think, in Estonia, and Germany for Poland. The idea is very simple, but I think very effective. It is one of deterrence. These are not forces that can go into battle against the 100,000 that we heard that the Zapad maneuvers are able to gather between Russia and Belarus. But they are a deterrent in the sense that if when Crimea was invaded, people just says, "Oh, what a pity! It's too bad," and did nothing about it. If anybody invades a NATO country, we know by now, and this has been affirmed in a number of summits, that there will not be any tergiversing and shilly-shallying about do we mean it with Article number 5? Are we serious about it? Are we going to philosophize about it? And meanwhile, another country goes down the drain. So the idea is that Article 5, yes, one country is attacked, it attacks NATO, and by having diverse NATO troops in each of these border countries, the first shot that gets fired will not necessarily hit an Estonian, a Latvian, or a Lithuanian. It could hit a Brit, a Canadian, an American, or an Italian. And it will be an attack on NATO, and NATO will have to react. By the way, with Ukraine, it is rather pathetic because there was an agreement in 1995, a Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear arms and received in return guarantees of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its territory from guess who? From the Russian Federation, from the United States of America, and from our dear friends in Great Britain.
I would maybe just add a couple of sentences, but I think in NATO terms it is called the enhanced forward presence, and in Estonia the lead country is Great Britain, and it is accompanied by troops from Denmark and France. Altogether there are maybe 1,000, 1,200 NATO allies troops in Estonia as we speak. Of course now, that number will never be enough in case of military conflict with Russia, but it is a serious part of deterrence. And what Russia is doing, they are trying to use propaganda to cultivate the knowledge, especially among Russian people living in Estonia. Remember, 30% of Estonian population is Russian people. So they are using propaganda to say that NATO troops in Estonia are occupiers. And we are trying very hard to create this anti-NATO sentiment, and that, believe us, in case of true war, NATO would never help you. So this is classical propaganda tricks that Russia is trying to use to discredit NATO.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to listen to all four of you. My name is Robert Melikian. Very quickly, two separate questions to whoever wants to handle them. Can China be used to keep Russia in check, getting closer to China, number one? And number two, do you think this extreme Russian expanding influence will continue after Putin is gone, or is it just a Putin thing? Thank you.
Well, to take up the second question first, there will be an election next month in Russia. So we're all in suspension about how it's going to turn out. Basically, you know, in Western countries, we have transparent rules, but the outcomes of elections are uncertain. In Russia, the rules are opaque, constantly changing, but the outcomes are predictable. So Vladimir Putin will receive a mandate of another 6 years. I'm afraid he has no exit strategy. For one thing, given all his misdeeds over the years, he's got a few enemies. And for another, he has a whole bunch of loyalists that he has to protect. It's a personalized system, and we have no idea what might happen if you take Mr. Putin out. That's another thing for us to worry about, what will ensue. So he is going to stick around, and I suspect that we can expect more of the same. About China, I'm afraid that China is pursuing its own national interests. There are some areas in which Chinese and Russian interests overlap. There was a big energy deal between Russia and China in terms of natural gas, and obviously the two countries have created a kind of an authoritarian empathy in working in some areas together. But they also have a divergence of interests, and they are competitors. So
I will just add one line that during the latest Zapad exercise, actually China partnered with Russia. China sent their Navy vessels into the Baltic Sea to participate in a joint exercise. So that is just a very short and narrow perspective on the case.
Just one thing on China. I think it's the other way around. I've been having this conversation with fellow journalists and analysts from various think tanks that maybe it's high time we start learning Chinese, because on the long run, we're not going to have a problem with Russia meddling in our elections or corrupting our politicians, because Russia's running out of money, Russia's running out of manpower, its population is shrinking. It's facing different kinds of economical and demographic problems. China has all the resources in the world, and they are not afraid to use it. They just have a very different strategy, and their strategy is decided for the following decades in advance. So they have a very different strategy, and I think that I don't want to give you any bad ideas that China is going to invade any neighboring countries, but certainly their army, their military capabilities, their resources are uncomparable to Russia.
Thank you, Paul Curice. I'm the director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. We're delighted to be sponsoring Michael Krauss as a visiting scholar for a few weeks. It's great to be partnering with the Malakian Center. I have a somewhat unpopular question to ask to at least two of the speakers who are academics, but to anybody else present. And it's about democracy and democracy's own weaknesses. It seems to me universities, certainly in the United States, we have so democratized our curricula, our disciplines, our requirements. I don't know of any requirements to study or be aware of international affairs more specifically. We have broad requirements about cultural awareness, perhaps, but America's going through a period of sort of insularism, and there's certainly not much in higher education in terms of requirements to suggest that Americans know about our own civic fundamentals, or to know about the great power and prominence of America in the world and whether it can be used for good or for bad. And that includes our inward turn being used for bad. And the second unpopular thought is that our presidential election, the office most important for setting our foreign policy, is now so democratic that anybody can run. Absolutely anybody can run for president in either of the major parties, apparently. And the parties really have nothing, there's no adult supervision. If this is seen as a particularly controversial question, I'm actually Peter McNamara from the School of Civic and Economic Thought.
I'm at a loss to answer because I'm a firm advocate of general education. I did spend much of my life in Canada, and I shall remain eternally grateful for my baccalaureate in general arts, it was called, and it really was general. You had to take a science, a social science, something from the humanities, and so on and so on. You were not allowed to just concentrate on one thing. But we just heard at the O'Connor Institute a reminder that Stanford used to have a wonderful course on the history of Western civilization, and then a few years ago they have stopped giving it. And that sounds extremely sad to me. Europe varies, of course. There are so many different systems, but one of the good things about Europe is these programs, the Erasmus programs that allow students to travel from one country to another, much as they did in the Middle Ages. Students would freely go from Bologna to Paris because they heard that there was a famous lecturer there. And nowadays it's happening again. I'm very happy here, being at the Barrett Honors College, to see that there are students there who are going, have been, or intend to go to all over the world, to Tajikistan and to learn Tajik there, and so on and so forth. Extremely impressive. And so that at least there is here in Arizona an island of openness to the world, and I'm very pleased to be here and participate.
I can just say that me and I and then Shabalch are here for 1 year only in the States, and we are enjoying the opportunity to learn from some of the best American journalists. Even now, as we speak here, we we are supposed to be in a class of Walter Robinson, who was for years the head of Spotlight investigative journalism unit in Boston Globe. So we should be in his class, but we sneaked out today. And we are taking like every opportunity to educate ourselves in these fields, even though we are here on a non-degree study. But what does amaze me, I'm sorry for the criticism, but I think we have even discussed it with Szabolcs, is that the amount of people who are willing to learn from such people, as like Walter Robinson or Len Downey from Washington Post, the classes are so empty for some reason, and that's like something that surprised us.
Well, just to add a note, if I understood your question correctly, I think I share your concern about what we have done in higher education in the United States, or not done. I believe, and I have been, following these developments, reading Freedom House every year, teach a course on comparative democratization. The region, of course, of my primary focus is Russia and East Europe. I did share the hopes that you expressed back in the 1990s and early years of the century that perhaps Russia would join the world of the Western world and embrace liberal values. But I'm afraid that we have to throw that idea out of the window. Russia has, in my view, fundamentally rejected the outcome of the Cold War. And under Putin, and it is seeking to, in the words of President Medvedev, he was a kind of a sidekick of Putin for a while, but he was the president for 4 years, to create its own sphere of influence. And it's, there's a statement on the record, Russia needs a sphere of influence. Well, what kind of a sphere is that? I think that what we are now witnessing, really, in terms of all these hybrid attacks and disinformation campaigns and the use of social media to advance basically one prime idea, which is that there really is no difference between the Russian system of rule and what we in the West call liberal democracy. That is the overarching objective. And I fear that it's only belatedly that we're catching on to the extent to which Russia has actually succeeded in this type of pursuit. But having said that, because we have a study that was issued recently last year by German Marshall Fund, which says that since 2004, Russia has actually interfered in something like 24 countries, that it has used disinformation, cyber attacks, troll farms, financial means to meddle in the internal affairs of at least 27 European, North American countries. And the goal is not so much to turn Americans to Russia, or the Czechs or the Hungarians for that matter, but rather it is to set Americans against their own government, to provoke unrest and discontent. And let's face it, Russia couldn't succeed in this effort were it not for the divisions that exist in our society or in other societies, the racial tensions. There's plenty to work with. And so I think, above all, we have to begin to put our own house in order and lead by example, so we have also credibility with other countries. And part of that is to perhaps introduce into our curriculum some of the fundamental precepts on which our political order is based, or that we have neglected to do. And I was just talking to a colleague yesterday who is at the Cronkite School visiting, and she comes from New England. Unfortunately, can't give you her name, but she works on the First Amendment issues.
And she reported in the surveys that they do that something like 30% of young Americans don't know what the First Amendment contains, what is covered in there. So where do we begin?
We are up against a deadline. I do like to end with an action item, which we just have, which is inform the citizens of the US. But let me, David, can you just gather whatever questions there are right now, and I'll give the panel a choice of what you want to answer as the last word after this round. So I see one hand here.
Can I still ask the question?
Say again?
Can I still ask the
Yes,
question?
please. We're going to gather the last comments from the floor, and then I'm going to turn over to the panel.
Okay. Ilana Orlich in Silk. I really enjoyed all the presentations, and I have been in all these countries, mainly thanks to the wonderful programs ASU has in Central and Eastern Europe. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this. I actually wanted to say, Professor Krauss, you mentioned the two governments, the two types of order that exist in the Czech Republic, the intellectuals and those who fear, in fact, globalism. And in connection to that, I wanted to mention the situation of Romania, which has actually coined the term of a parallel state, except in this case, and that might be of interest, the parallel power does not fear globalization as much as it fears Russia. And so there are these obscure connections with the United States. So this is apropos of what you were saying, that at the end of the day, there seems to be this fear of the neo-colonization, and it's the idea of fear from Russia or fear of what the money from the West can bring into the country to support, in fact, the corruption of Romania. And I'm sure you heard about the two spies, the exchange that has been going on about Romania being corrupt like the Russians, but with a sense of entitlement like Italians. So I think that is very much mirrored in the two governments. But my question really has to do with the Hungarian journalists' narration. I really enjoyed the narratives that you presented. My question has to do with the current meeting of Viktor Orban, whom you mentioned, in Sofia, meeting with Sebastian Kurz, the new and very young Chancellor of Austria, and having to do with migration. Hungary is notably the only country that has, in the European Union, that has so far received 0 migrants. And so how do you see this situation with Orban and with what is going on in Hungary? And by the way, Jobbik, as you know, has had a remarkable presence in central Romania. So I'm curious to know your position about Orban's meeting with Kurz currently in Sofia, Bulgaria.
So can you just hold your answer? We're just going to gather a couple more questions, give you guys the choice of who you respond to.
Thank you, all of you. Michael Ostling from Barrett, the Honors College. We heard from, I think, all of you about the skill with which Russia divides or exploits the divisions in other countries. But in all of the comments, Russia seemed to be a monolith. Russia was one big thing. And I wonder, and it's a real question, not a rhetorical question, whether there might not be divisions within Russia, and whether there might not be people within Russia who don't agree with the Putin regime's strategy and who would like a turn towards the West or would like a turn towards various kinds of democracy. And whether, if that is the case, talking about Russia rather than talking about a particular regime does a disservice to the Russian people.
So my question is, if we can't depend upon NATO, and if we can't make the assumption that the United States is going to remain active as a leader and in contrast to Russia, then what potential does being a member of the EU offer people in the Baltics, Eastern European countries that have joined the European Union? Does that reduce that threat of Russian ambition in the region, in your opinion, or is the European Union membership something that does not make a difference?
We can take this, just one more here, and then I'll turn back to the panelists. The panelists, I believe, are all joining us for the reception, so if you have other questions, I hope you'll address them there.
Certainly. My question is more on the economic side of it. There seems to be a discontent with how you approach Russia, and there's obviously a gap with historical precedents that does affect relations in that sense. But do you think that if there was a more bias towards Russia and away from this European perspective, that, you know, given the power block that Russia has with Kazakhstan and even ethnic differences, do you think there is a future for cooperation where there could be economic growth to both bolster your countries as well as those in between, like Belarus and Ukraine?
I'll answer briefly about European defense. I happen to have sat on several committees looking at European defense, a common European defense. And in fact, some years ago, I was part also on a reflection group on the future of Europe. And we came up with a conclusion that Europe needs to collaborate between the different member countries in terms of defense, especially in terms of procurement, in compatibility of military forces. This has been recognized, I think, for a number of years now, but it remains largely at the level of rhetoric because each country has its own champions. One country has champion tanks, and one country has champion planes, and so on and so forth. So there is that competition. I think we had a question about Hungary, concretely.
Thank you. So just to give you all the context of the question, as a result of the civil war in Syria, and as a result of poverty in other regions in the Middle East and in North Africa, a so-called migration crisis erupted 2 or 3 years ago, and it peaked when an influx of a couple of maybe 1 million migrants total in 1 year. They just took a route through Turkey and through Italy, and they ended up in Germany and in other European countries. And there was a so-called migrant route, the Western Balkan route, which went through Turkey, Greece, the countries in the Balkans, and Hungary. So when my government was facing this influx of migrants, they decided to, guess what, build a huge wall on the southern border to keep them out. And they did that, and they built a whole political campaign in demonizing refugees coming from war-torn countries, poor people coming from countries which the US president says are shithole countries. So very unfortunate people, they were fleeing war, they were fleeing poverty, and the Hungarian government decided to erect a barbed wire fence in front of them. And they are today campaigning with fear-mongering. They are saying that if we take in migrants, then our society will be Muslimized. We will lose our white Christian identity. So the Hungarian government has built a political campaign on that, and it pays off. So that's why their popularity is skyrocketing. It's half of the population supporting that because they really believe that we have to fear migrants. And what we've seen with the election in Austria is that there's a new coalition government in Vienna with the Freedom Party, with a former hardcore far-right party which tries to rebrand itself as a moderate conservative party, but in fact they still have their far-right origins. And this party joined forces with the traditional conservative party of Austria, and it seems that they are also accepting this hardline stance on immigration. Of course, they do not accept the rhetorics of Viktor Orbán. They do not accept the rhetorics of the Hungarian government, but they also want to restrict migration. And then there are talks that Austria might join the so-called Visegrad countries, the Central European countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, which basically established an alliance of so-called troublemakers, countries which are constantly having debates with Brussels, with the European Union, for instance, on the issue of migration. And I don't know where Austria is going to end up, but I think Austrian politicians and the Austrian establishment is more clever than simply going to that direction that these former Soviet bloc countries are following.
I will try to address the question about if we are doing harm to Russians who do not share the vision of Kremlin and Putin, and is there a second approach inside Russia as well. Even last year, there were protests all over Russia against the Putin regime. A couple of years before that, there were huge protests in Moscow, and the sentiment among younger people is growing more and more strongly against Putin. So in that sense, yes, when we are talking about Russia, Russians, of course we are doing harm to a lot of people who don't share the views of the Kremlin regime, and we should be strictly and narrowly speaking of Putin and his cronies. That is fact. But unfortunately, of course, there is Alexei Navalny, who is gaining popularity in Russia, but in March he is not allowed to run in the presidential elections. So unfortunately, we don't see any change to the regime in Kremlin. Last July, when I was working on a spy story actually in southeastern part of Estonia, and actually I was coming from an interview with one of the guys I showed on the slides, who ran quite a remarkable cigarette smuggling gang on the southeastern border between Estonia and Russia. I was starting to drive from southeastern Estonia to Riga, where my wife lives, and I picked up a pair of hitchhikers. They were in their 20s, a young couple from St. Petersburg, and we had 3 hours in the car up until Riga. They needed to go to Riga, and so it means that we had a lot of time to talk. And we did, of course, talk a lot, mostly about politics. And I was really fascinated by these people. They told me, for example, that the girl has a birthday on the 9th of May, which for Russia marks the end of a great patriotic war, and resembles every year huge military parades with huge patriotic day. And they say that for every year during that time, they want to escape St. Petersburg and Russia. They travel to Tallinn, Estonia, they travel to Finland, to Latvia, and so on, just because they feel so bad inside it. They didn't hide anything about how they feel about Putin. And these are not just like two people. There are tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of people just like them. But they don't have a voice. They don't have a voice where they can. Russian regime, the Kremlin regime, is even blocking social media channels. That is the problem.
On that theme, thank you for the question about Russia, because we did indeed, for the sake of simplicity, refer to Russia as if it is indeed Mr. Putin who owns it. We know from Russian history that Russia's people have risen against their regime. And from more recent years, as you've just mentioned, we've seen in 2011 massive protests in capital cities in Russia that caught us all by surprise. And they came from the new middle classes that Vladimir Putin created, or his economic policies created. They stood up against him. We know about the Russians who have stood up against him. They bear names like Anna Politkovskaya, the Russian journalist who wrote a critical reportage about the horrible war in Chechnya. She paid for that with her life. We know about Boris Nemtsov, a distinguished figure, opposition leader, who was murdered in 2015. And the list goes on. So yes, let us not lose sight of the other Russia because it's there. And potentially it's our ally. We should not shut the doors or penalize the other Russia for the sins of the regime that, though they have resisted, they're powerless to change.
So thanks again to our panelists. All four of our panelists are actually holding other events in the next couple of weeks. So please check in with them if you want to see any of these folks again. But for now, please join us next door for reception where they will be. And first join me in thanking them for their presentation.